Major General Tim Hodgetts. If we can welcome him to the stage, please. Thank you.
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for those kind words of introduction. So this is me, and as you can see, like many doctors, I suffer from multiple diplomatosis. But there is one particular post-nominal that you should all aspire to, FRCEM, Fellow of Relentless Conferences and Endless Meetings. Now, these are the jobs that actually pay me, but other than those, I'm very strongly motivated by charity. So, is that going to work for me? Are we on? I'll try again. We're not on. Flick the switch. Are we good to go? Standing like a statue. Are we good? There we go. So, motivated by charity. So, I am a trustee of London's Air Ambulance. I think you know what that does. I'm a trustee of the Poppy Factory, and that does what it says on the tin, quite literally. And I'm also a trustee of Citizen Aid, which is a charity we set up to give the public free information and training to be prepared, not scared, in the unlikely but not impossible event of being caught up in a deliberate attack. If you want to know more about that, go and see Mike, because we've got a stand out in the exhibition area. Now, when I saw the title of this particular conference, it really chimed with me. Because if you stick one word in there, a journey of personal adaptability and 30 years of emergency planning and resilience, that could be my career life story. But I'm not going to specifically focus on that. Rather, I'm going to look at it through the perspective of war, conflict, and disaster, and talk about planning for some of the ultimate crises. And specifically, I'm going to give you three particular flavors. I'm going to tell you a story, and that's a story of my experience in dealing with disaster and crisis, and also what learning I've taken from those experiences and spread them more widely. And then I'm going to finish with some reflection of precepts in mass casualty management, in emergency planning, and also some reflection on how I have sustained my own personal resilience through quite a stormy career. So the experience I've had is in both the military and the civilian environments, and while they are very different environments, the principles, I would say, are directly transferable between the two. But my first experience, I've got to dial the clock back to 1988 when I was a junior doctor in Germany. I know, babyface, I've been around a while. And it was in the British Military Hospital in Hanover when the IRA was very active on the continent. And we had drive-by shootings in the Channel ports, drive-by shootings at the hospital, 2 car bombs in the street that I lived. So it was no surprise when we got a coded warning and we had to evacuate the hospital out onto the grassed area there. One of the soldiers woke up from his operation, looked up at blue sky, thought he'd gone to heaven. So what did I take away from that particular incident? Well, the hospital didn't really have a major incident plan as we understand them today. So I wrote a major incident plan, and I set up an empty ward to be able to deal with a surge of casualties. What a great opportunity that is. I mean, you won't find an empty ward today in the NHS. And I also set up some equipment so that we could take it outside the hospital and use it on casualties if we had sustained them while they were outside being looked after. And I took all of the lessons and I codified them in my first book, which I wrote on a £30 Boots typewriter, and it included 3 particular scenarios: a plane crash, a train crash, and a terrorist bomb. And that thinking turned out to be really prudent thinking for the day that changed my life. The 2nd of November 1991, 3:53 in the afternoon, I remember it well, England versus Australia, Rugby World Cup final. I was in Northern Ireland, and the IRA placed a bomb against the underground escape door of our social club in the military wing of Musgrave Park Hospital. It destroyed the emergency department, the operating theatre, the ITU. The ground floor collapsed into the basement, the first floor collapsed into the ground floor, the hospital was on fire. Fortunately, I was 100 metres away at the time in another building for packing my boxes, because it was my last day in Northern Ireland. I was the first on scene, went into the burning hospital, evacuated the hospital wards, set up a treatment facility out in the road, and acted as the medical commander. So I reflected very deeply on that particular incident. I thought we did pretty well, but how on earth do we do better? And I wrote an article in the journal Injury. I wrote 2 books and a course with colleagues in Manchester, and that's the MIMS course, Major Incident Medical Management and Support. Now, of course, I could have become quite depressed about this. I could have had PTSD. But what I understand now that I experienced is post-traumatic growth, that I took a really difficult incident and I turned it into something positive, which was then able to propagate for the benefit of others. I do, though, however, want to just mention my colleagues who were co-authors and co-architects of the MIMS programme, so Kevin McAway-Jones and Matthew Cook, who as all 3 of us are now professors of emergency medicine. But this was a Manchester initiative, and we ran the first course in Manchester 30 years ago. So we're 30 years old too. And what it turned out to be was a generic solution to an international problem, and it became accepted very rapidly by other nations. So when I found myself in Australia in 1994 as a trauma fellow in Sydney, they wanted the MIMS programme. So I set up MIMS Australia in 1994, and it's still going today, together with the generic instructor course. Now, for the first course of 16 candidates, there was 1 instructor, me, and I would not recommend that as a model in the future. I nearly had to be carried out in a box after 3 days of giving all of the lectures and all of the practical skill stations. But it then rapidly spread around the world, and I personally introduced it to the Netherlands, to Sweden, to Italy, to Slovenia, while colleagues took it to Japan and other countries. And of course, what we identified, again quite early, was that we needed a military version of this civilian course. The civilian course was actually military principles for civilians. So we were now going full circle and teaching these military principles back to the military. But we developed a course, and I started teaching the military version from 1998, but it became the NATO standard from 2004 and still runs today at the Military Medical Centre of Excellence in Budapest. So that's NATO's Military Medical Centre of Excellence. I went back to the UK in 1995 as a new consultant to Frimley Park Hospital. I know we've got people in the audience from Frimley Park Hospital. And not only was I the A&E consultant, but I was the emergency planning officer as a secondary role, as it was then called, working to the health emergency planning advisor, a guy called Chris Gundry, if anybody remembers him. And we had a great time writing the plan for the hospital, getting new equipment, exercising regularly, and then taking the learning around other hospitals in the region and giving them sort of one-day programs in mini-MIMS. For the next 6 years, while I was at Frimley Park, I was engaged in supporting the rewrite of that NHS document, Planning for Major Incidents. I became the senior medical officer for the old Wembley Stadium, which had 85 medical staff on duty. And it was a great major incident plan, which we exercised during Euro 96. And I was invited back to Sydney in 2000 to be the advisor on their major incident planning for the Sydney Olympics. But in amongst this, I went to Kosovo. Went to Kosovo in the first field hospital that deployed after the 76 days of aerial bombardment, and we set up just outside the capital, Pristina. And while there, I took that learning from the civilian setting, the hospital major incident plan, to write a military hospital major incident plan and a disaster plan for Kosovo, bringing in all of the international allies who were in Kosovo, as well as Russia, who weren't even invited. And some of the applied learning from there was that major incidents are much more common in field hospitals. And the reasons are really quite obvious, that you've only got a limited number of people, there's nobody else you can call in from home. You've got a limited amount of equipment and a very long and contested supply chain. You're in a high-threat environment that generates pulses of seriously injured casualties. So it's very easy to tip into that major incident mode. While in Kosovo, just outside the capital, there was a guy called Professor Tony Redmond. Anybody know him? He's from Manchester, is well known in the disaster medicine setting. But he was acting as the medical director at Pristina Hospital on behalf of Department for International Development. And he said, can you come in and build an emergency department, because they haven't got one, in this 2,400-bedded hospital that was completely failing. Booby traps on the incubators. Bottom right, that's the only light source on the obstetric unit. Top left, limbs being thrown out of the operating theatre window and dogs running round with limbs in their jaws. Not a well-functioning hospital. So I went in with a small team to set up this emergency centre. So we cleared out what was a pharmacy, and we brought in 13 tons of equipment within 48 hours. We got the local builders in, and we built this new emergency centre to UK best practice standards within 6 weeks, and introduced a specialty, because they didn't have a specialty of emergency medicine. Now you say, well, how on earth can you do all that in 6 weeks? And I'd say, it's amazing what you can achieve with a smile and a gun. A couple of years later in Oman, we again were planning for major incidents, and we did have a major incident from heat illness. This was 24,000 British soldiers on exercise in the summer in the Omani desert. Not surprising we got heat illness. But what did surprise me was that the ambulance service decided to take down all of its tents and move location at midday. So not only did the tents collapse, so did the people. And how do you get the people to hospital when it's the ambulance service that are the casualties? I also had to plan for a specific event in Oman, that at the end of this 3-month exercise, where people have been sleeping rough and no alcohol by the side of their vehicles, we were going to allow 8,000 of them to come together into a makeshift stadium that we built out of wood. We were going to show them England versus Greece live on the big screens. We gave them beer for free, and then we had ladies dancing on the stage. And as the song goes, I predict a riot. It was absolutely the case. Now, there was an inflection point, or in fact 2 inflection points while in Oman. The first was that England beat Germany 5-1, and that was something that hadn't happened for a while. But we also had 9/11. So we're sitting there in the middle of the desert in a field hospital thinking, well, where are we going now then? And sure enough, we went to Afghanistan. So we moved across to Afghanistan in 2002. And I was called forward at very short notice. I was told the med plan's a problem. Well, it was actually different words used, but the med plan's a problem. Go and sort out the med plan. And you've got a week. So I took a light bag, got out to Bagram Air Base, and then I got stuck there because the emergency department consultant became ill. I took over his job. And then within a couple of days, we had an infectious disease outbreak. And we don't seem to be advancing. Have we stopped advancing? Have we gone wobble again? Is it not working? Doesn't seem to be advancing. Just wait out. Yep, good. There we go. So we had an infectious disease outbreak of severe gastroenteritis. This is the standard of the toilets, by the way. Severe gastroenteritis and meningitis. So we had our own people on ventilators with meningitis. And indeed, within 3 days, 60% of the hospital staff had been wiped out. And we're flying people back to the UK. And I wrote down in my log, feel like Lieutenant Chard at Rorke's Drift. The next year, we're in Kuwait on the eve of warfighting in Iraq. And we had a very small field hospital to start with, which I was in as the senior doctor, and then we built a bigger field hospital alongside it. But what I was really concerned about was chemical weapons and chemical injuries. Now, we genuinely believed there was a threat of chemical weapons, and we were in and out of our gas masks while the Scud missiles were coming in. And I got the guidelines out of the box, and they were written in 1988, and I said, well, these are no good. So I had to sit down and start writing new guidelines in the middle of the desert to then distribute around the various field hospitals. And these guidelines endure today. We have been updating them, but they're called clinical guidelines for operations. But there were some real challenges of being in Iraq during warfighting. The number of casualties, the severity of the casualties, far greater severity than we're used to seeing in the civilian setting. And the type of casualties, lots of children. It wasn't our mission to treat children, but you put a red cross on the top of your green tent and the families will come with their kids. Also, the environment. You can see this tornado going through the hospital complex. Fortunately, it missed the clinical complex, which was completely full. It went through the accommodation, my accommodation, and indeed, it picked up a nurse in a shower tent like Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz and carried her along the tarmac. In 1998, just rewinding slightly, I had rewritten Battlefield First Aid for the Army, and I had taken MIM's principles, those 7 principles, and distilled them down to control and act, assess, communicate, triage. But this needed a refresh before the fighting started. So very rapidly, we were able to refresh battlefield casualty drills and get it out to all the soldiers before the fighting started. Within the Iraq conflict, the methane message became the main message for communicating about multiple casualties. So this was from 2003 onwards. I invented the methane message in 1992 while sitting in a golf club in Stirling. But it wasn't until 2012 that we got it into Jessup. So 20 years before we got methane, having been invented, into Jessup. Let's hope we can move a bit faster in the future. Moving into Afghanistan, my challenge of a major incident was being the helicopter doctor, flying forward into the firefight, into the poppy fields to pick up casualties and then treat them in the back of the helicopter on the way back to the hospital, which was quite a long distance, 30 to 45 minutes flying time. Now, the textbook told us you could get 22 casualties in the back of a Chinook helicopter. Well, that's true if it was completely empty. But there are 17 people on that helicopter when it leaves the air point of departure, when it leaves the base, because you've got the flight crew, the medical crew, the gunners, the loading officer, and an 8-man quick reaction force. But I did manage to get 11 casualties on the back of that helicopter, lying on the floor, lying across the legs of soldiers sitting down, babes being held in the arms of soldiers, while I swung like a gibbon on the ropes that hang from the inside of the helicopter to try and treat them in the 30 minutes. Back to Afghanistan in 2009, this time to be the medical director of a multinational field hospital. Now, what I worried about before I went on this deployment, which was half Danish, a quarter American, a quarter Brit, and an Estonian, what I worried about was, what if we have a major incident and everybody defaults to their own language? So I learned Danish. I went and had one-to-one tuition in Copenhagen. I went and worked in their trauma center in Copenhagen to make sure I understood their culture and their language, and it all worked fine. But there is a reason that only 5.5 million people in the world speak Danish, because it's like gargling pebbles. And this particular situation really showed adaptability as well, where we rapidly moved outside the hospital and spilling out with improvised treatment bays. Now, I've been exploiting this MIMS framework for a good many years, for a couple of decades, 3 decades, in fact. I modified MIMS to a resource-poor version, which we called National Disaster Preparedness Course for Hospitals. I was invited by the Indians to go over on the first anniversary of the Bhuj earthquake, and then for the next 10 years, we spread this across India until we handed it over to the UN to continue that particular work. I've been to a number of countries, some of which are listed here, invited by the royal family in Jordan, for example, to go and look at their entire system and then give an appreciation of how they can improve their national resilience. And I was the international expert advisor on the Katastrophenkommissionen, which was the Swedish High Court Commission after the Asian tsunami in 2004, where 800 Swedes were dead or missing and 2,500 were seriously injured when they were in Thailand. Because where do well-heeled Scandinavians go at Christmas? It was out to Thailand. On the day that we published the report, and you can probably find it on the internet in both Swedish and English, was the day that they put out a TV documentary. They'd followed us round, and the result of that was that the Swedish foreign minister resigned and the head of the National Crisis Centre was sacked. And there are worse places to be famous than Sweden. But I've been really keen on transferring lessons from the military setting to the civilian setting, because this is something that has happened repeatedly over the last 100 years. So medicine advances in war, and in peace, you move those lessons across to the civilian setting, or indeed in long conflict, you do it during the conflict. So when the Healthcare Commission came out to Afghanistan, the precursor of the Care Quality Commission, they said that our care was exemplary. And they had never before used that descriptor for either an ambulance service or a hospital. And they said, what can you do to support the NHS? Well, what we did was that we were very much instrumental in the development of the national network of major trauma centres. And this is one of them in Birmingham. And what else we did in Birmingham, which is where all the seriously injured soldiers come back to, is that we took our experience and we created clinical guidelines for the NHS for blast and ballistic injury, injuries of terrorism. We did this in 2017. And if you look at the guidelines I wrote back in 2004, they're pretty similar. That what we've done is we've contextualized the military guidelines for the civilian setting. Also, what I was concerned about in 2016 was terrorism marching across Europe. You could see this happening. You knew it was going to come back to the UK. Who's preparing the public to deal with serious, life-threatening injury? The answer was nobody. You could go on a health and safety at work first aid course and worry about trapping your finger in the door, but it wasn't going to teach you what to do if you'd lost a limb or you had severe ballistic injury. So together with colleagues in Birmingham, we set up a charity, Citizen Aid. It gives a free app to the public to respond safely in these particular situations, and there's lots of information on the website. But as I said, if you want to learn more about this, go and see Mike out in the coffee area. In 2014, I was the Medical Director for Defence, and along came Ebola. And it was judged at that time by Department for International Development, we were the only agency who could go out quickly and set up safely. And the only reason that the minister allowed us to go was that the risk was assessed as less than 1% chance of any of our staff getting Ebola. Now, given we had less than 100 staff, that meant that any one case of Ebola would have been mission failure. But that learning was really, really useful, obviously for the COVID crisis, where we could creatively swipe some of that learning of dealing in a highly infectious disease environment. At the time, I was the head of the Army Medical Services, and I was looking after the health of the Army and making sure that the Army remained deployable and that we could use our Army staff, both medical and non-medical, effectively to support national resilience. So you'll have seen our medics doing testing, doing vaccination, driving ambulances, treating in ambulances, on the wards, on ITU, and supporting the build of Nightingales. And earlier this year, we had the Turkey earthquake, and for the first time, we worked together with a UK NGO, UK Med, to plan together, deploy together, and use the combined capabilities where we can take a surgical facility, but the civilians can rapidly put paediatricians and obstetricians out into a theatre and work in that collaborative way. But my life has been dominated in almost the last 2 years now by the Russo-Ukraine war. And in my role as the senior medical advisor to NATO, making sure that all of the NATO alliance is prepared should that war spread, and what we call Article 5, to another NATO member state, and then it's all in if a NATO member state is threatened. And I've been working with civilian agencies in this country to ensure that we are appropriately prepared for reception of mass casualties. You won't have seen a lot on that because obviously we've been playing it close to our chest. And now we've got another conflict. And we're still working out how we can use our medical services to support that particular conflict, and specifically on that humanitarian side. What I can tell you is that already we have our hospital on a ship in the Eastern Mediterranean. It will be a political decision how we use it, but at least the asset is there. And if the UK wants to use a military medical asset for humanitarian reasons, then we're already on site. So finishing off now with a little bit of reflection, some planning precepts, and how to stay personally resilient from my own perspective. The planning precepts, I'm sure you know many of these, but there might be one or two that are new to you. So, no plan withstands first contact with an enemy, so you've got to be flexible. You've got to be prepared to adapt your plan, however good you thought it was. If nobody reads your plan, it's pretty useless. It's what we call in the military shelfware. And this was a quote from Field Marshal Rommel, that the British write some of the best doctrines, some of the best plans, but it was really good, unfortunate for the Germans, that our officers didn't read it. And then we got Eisenhower telling us that planning is everything, but the plan is nothing. Now, this audience will know this more than anybody else, because what really matters is getting round these tables, talking to each other, making the relationships, so that when it does happen and you have to be adaptive, you know who you can pick up the phone and speak to, and get things done. So it's the planning process that's really important. When you deal with casualty surges, and we do regularly in the military, we will want to optimize if we can and give the highest standard of care that is available. But we will improvise, and we will know that it's okay to improvise. We will improvise equipment, we'll improvise extra beds, and if necessary, we'll move our staff around different departments and improvise where they are working. But if you must, then you have to compromise. And this is what's been fixing us in NATO. What are the precepts that we can make sure that when we do compromise, people are compromising consistently? And we now have the 8 Ds of dealing with an enduring mass casualty situation. You won't probably have come across these unless you are tracking the literature very closely, because there's recently been a letter about it in The Lancet and an article in BMJ Military Health. But I would strongly commend this audience to look at the 8 Ds, because this is when your incident goes on far longer than you had anticipated, and you really are in a difficult situation having to compromise. Now, I've codified a number of crisis precepts in a number of books. All of the proceeds go to charities, so if you're interested, they are available. But what about personal resilience? Well, first of all, building personal resilience, I think, comes through training and experience. And as an emergency physician, I've had pretty good training and I've had regular experience of dealing with difficult situations. But there are some situations that are just unimaginable. And I won't tell you them today, because I will just be transferring my pain onto you. What we've done in the military, for every single soldier who now comes into the army, they get something called OpSmart in their basic training, optimizing performance through stress management and resilience training. So it's sports psychology, it's a bit of mindfulness, it's various elements of well-being, and then there are 85 touch points in the rest of their career as they progress through, where we re-emphasize these particular points. Now, on the maintenance side, you'll see in grey mindfulness, because this is something that's relatively new, and certainly in the time period that I was exposed to most of my traumas, we weren't doing mindfulness, so it's not something I've particularly used myself, but those in the audience may already be using that effectively. For me, it's been about acceptance, recognizing that you might die today, so suck it up and just get on with the job, and reflection, writing articles, books, lectures, courses, and poetry. I now have an anthology of contemporary war poetry. I am going to inflict it on the world as of next summer, when it's going to come out in a book. And I will just give you one sample today, because it fits with this week, which is a remembrance week. So this poem is called The Black Snake, and the image is of Royal Wootton Basset. Long and black, with high gloss back, is our most deadly snake. Through glass belly the mourners see Britain on the caskets draped. The legion's flags with respect sag, dipping as the snake glides by. A petal shower forms a thin cover as families in silence cry. This wooden meal, far from unreal's a consequence of modern war, where choice, not need, impels we feed the virtuous cycle to endure. So it is remembrance, lest we forget, and I would say that my continuing motivation, which has been throughout the last 30 years, was those who died in that incident in Northern Ireland. And I think anybody in this audience who's been involved in a major incident has a bit of a life before and a life after. These are sort of worldview changing events. So I hope then you've enjoyed a little bit of a flavour of a story of my journey through crisis and conflict, some of the learning that I've extracted and been able to spread, and a little bit about sustaining personal resilience. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, crikey, Tim. Thank you, if I may call you Tim. Thank you. I don't really have words yet, which is unusual for me. I'm still forming my response. That was incredible. Thank you so much.